One. Welcome, everyone. We are joined by Rabbi Pini live from Beverly Hills, California. We're very honored to have him. Rabbi Donner is one of the most prominent voices of Orthodoxy, not only in the United States, but also in England and beyond. He's a rabbi there, but originally from London. And while it's always a joy to speak to Rabbi Donner, the occasion is not as joyous as speaking to him. We'd like to speak about the surge in anti-Semitism, both in the East Coast, West Coast, but also, unfortunately, in Europe and in other places around the world. So, Rabbi Donner, welcome.
Thank you so much for including me, Rabbi Pupko. A great honor and actually a treasured moment to be online with a member of the Chofetz Chaim's family.
Not directly related, but still related.
Okay. The Pupko name was his surname, as we all know. And it's not the one that he's widely known by, but he certainly carried that surname. And his son, Rabbi Aryeh Leib, carried that name. So it's a great honor. And you come from a distinguished rabbinic family.
Thank you. It's interesting. His grandson was a Levinson. He married not a Pupko, but my great aunt from the Sapir family. So there were a few connections because it was a
the family stayed connected. You know, I come from, as you know, a Yeki background, 1,000 years in Germany, and there's no Frum Yekka that isn't related somehow to other Yekkas. All Yekkas are related. There's a reason for that, because the Frum community in the 19th century in Germany shrunk so much that it was, if they wanted to, of course, they didn't want to marry Ostjuden. I mean, you couldn't marry the primitives.
You would never do such a thing.
Yeah, they could never do a thing like that. So they all married in each other's families, and they were all related to each other. So if I go on jenny.com and I look for how I'm related to a particular Yeki family, it's much closer than you'd ever believe.
Whole world.
Yeah.
I guess with that in mind and such a history and perspective, I guess I would love to hear your perspective on what's going on. What should be the response of Jews, Orthodox Jews, non-Orthodox Jews to what's going on? What we're seeing is, I would say, unprecedented in the history of the United States Jewish community. Definitely in the way things have turned, gone from one bad thing to the other. What should be the response of Jews, Orthodox Jews, non-Orthodox Jews to this?
So I'm going to divide the question up because it's an extremely broad question. And I don't think it's possible to answer it in kind of one snappy answer. We're all used to sound bites, and we have to fit everything that we say into just the exact number of letters that can fit into a tweet. But that's not the way it works, really. So I'll begin by saying that last week I had a frantic phone call from a British young man who lives in Los Angeles. I actually did his bar mitzvah with him when I was a rabbi in London. He now lives in West Hollywood and is a member of my shul. And he was completely overwhelmed. He works in the Bay Area in San Francisco, somewhere around there. I expect he's in some type of electronics related business. And he told me that the level of hostility towards Jews and Israel over the past 2 weeks has been something he's just never experienced before. And he was really asking me, how do I react to this? I said, do you remember the 2014 Gaza war? He said, no, I don't. Truthfully, I don't. So I said, he's a young man, he's probably 30 years old. And at that stage, he may have been in college or something. I don't know. He just was not conscious of it. So I said, but I said, not only do I remember that, I remember the one in 2008. I remember the Intifada in the early 2000s. I remember the Intifada when I was in yeshiva. In fact, I remember as far back, not because I was of age, but I remember as far back as the first Lebanon War in the early 1980s. I still remember the reaction in the British media to the Sabra Shatila massacres, which was carried out by phalangist Christian forces against the Palestinian refugee camps in the early 1980s. And there was a famous investigation of that and it spelt the end of Menachem Begin's political career. He was this dynamic prime minister who had kind of swept Israel by storm by taking the prime minister's role in the 1970s, and this totally wiped him out. What I'm saying is that, what we're seeing now is just a repeat of what we've seen time after time after time. Whenever Israel has the upper hand militarily, the world reacts negatively. It's a simple fact. You just have to accept it. Nobody's particularly concerned. I know that we have a lot of whataboutism, what's going on in Syria, what's going on in Zimbabwe, and what's going on here and there, and in Burma, I don't know. Nobody cares about Burma. And nobody particularly cares about what's going on in Syria. The 150 people a day still dying in Syria, nobody particularly cares. They do care that the Jewish state stands up for itself and pounds people who hurl rockets in its direction. Whether those rockets kill people is irrelevant, actually, because they're intended to kill people. No rockets are fired ever with intent that people should just, they should land and they should be wrapped in ribbons and taken to Kiddush on Shabbos. That's not why they're sent. They're sent to kill people. So there's no great shock to me. I don't want to consider myself jaded, but there's no great shock to me. But there is a shock to American Jewry. And the shock to American Jewry was the topic of discussion in an interview I gave last week to Forward. And that is that you've seen over the past 10 years an incredible shift on the left of center political party, the Democrats, with regard to Israel. I'm not taking a partisan stand here. I'm simply making an observation that whereas Democrats and Republicans gave bipartisan support to Israel through thick and thin over the past, let's call it 40, 50 years, certainly since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, that paradigm has shifted, and it has shifted irretrievably. The question is, how do we react to that? And my comment was that actually, I think that Jews who vote Democrat, and I was talking about this during the recent election, Jews who vote Democrat are more concerned about social issues in the United States than they are about the safety and security of the state of Israel. Their reaction to me when I raise this with them is not that they don't support Israel, but that when it comes to Israel, the Democrats will always have Israel's back. And therefore, as long as, at that stage, that's what they were talking about, we get rid of Trump, that's all that's important. Now, the question for Jews has to be, what is our priority? What do we prioritize? Do we prioritize the safety and security of the state of Israel? Even if that means that sometimes Israel does things which make us feel uncomfortable. Because I want to be very frank with you, Rabbi Pupko, I'm not comfortable with children dying. It doesn't matter if they're Palestinian children or if they're Jewish children. I'm just not comfortable with children dying. But what are we comfortable with? Are we comfortable with a country that defends itself in the way that it sees fit to protect what I want to tell you is almost the majority of Jews in the world, because almost half the Jews in the world now live in Israel? Or am I going to say, well, actually, that doesn't make any sense. The state of Israel, therefore, doesn't make any sense. And therefore, whatever the world has to offer in terms of criticizing Israel is something I just have to live with, and I'm not going to protest. That is a stark choice. And what we've seen is in the United States is a radical shift, a real shift in the views of Jews with regard to Israel that hasn't ever happened before. And that even, 2014, it happened a little bit, but now we're seeing it in such technicolor. There is such a change in the attitude that it's shocking us. And this has got nothing to do with the Gentile reaction. The Gentile reaction is just, if you want, the mass response to what I would say is the Jewish reaction. If you've got Jews who oppose Israel for reacting in the way that they have at the rocket attacks that came from Gaza, then of course you've got Gentile or non-Jewish people who respond in the same way and probably with an additional aspect of animosity, or at least not particular fondness for Jews.
Just a lot to unpack there. So just a few questions on that. In terms of comparing what's going on now to what happened in the world in 2014, 2008, etc., do you think that what's going on the streets of Los Angeles and New York now has happened before?
Well, I grew up with it. I grew up with people throwing stones and being aggressive towards Jews. We were very familiar with it in London, and I studied in yeshiva in Gateshead, and the anti-Semitism was palpable. People don't like Jews in Europe.
New York?
In Europe.
Yeah, but I know, but what we've seen in New York over the past week, where
that's a chiddush. I will say it straight out. That's a chiddush. The fact is that American Jews have lived under an illusion. I always say that in terms of advances, Europe is always 20 years behind America. And in terms of anti-Semitism, America is always 20 years behind Europe. It's just a rule of thumb. So what we have experienced in Europe for the past 20 years, which is a resurgence in anti-Jewish feelings and this idea that Israel is not legitimate. My father used to put it very starkly. He said around the year 2000, I can't tell you if it was 1995 or 2003, but around that time, he started saying the post-Holocaust honeymoon is over. In other words, for 50 years, roughly, European Gentiles were cautious about their attitude towards Jews, in the recognition that Europe, if not collectively, but at least on its shores, had perpetrated the greatest genocidal crime in the history of mankind against a particular group of people called Jews. And they were conscious of the fact that they needed to acknowledge that, or at least take it into account when they made certain pronouncements about Jews or Israel. That changed in around the year 2000. That's what my father was saying. In America, the support for Israel and the support for whatever Israel did in its defense and protection was universal and across the board. That seems to have changed over the past 10 years. We see that with the election into Congress of people who are openly anti-Semitic, which I would say is something that we haven't seen probably since the 1930s and 1940s in the US. And that has come as a great shock to Jews in America. So what you're seeing on the streets of New York is a symptom. You're not seeing it. It's something that's a reflection of a sea change, of a shift in the way people perceive Jews and Israel. And that's something which you can't control, actually. The only thing you can control is your reaction to it.
Before I get to what the reaction should be, I guess something that I've brought up before, which is my personal opinion on this, if you look at the congressional and other maps, electoral maps in New York, I believe except for two, every single congressional seat can be flipped by Orthodox Jews, never mind Jews alone. So it's interesting, with the exception of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who I'm assuming you're referring to as the most anti-Semitic member of Congress since the 30s, which so she hardly has a Jewish population in her district, and the other one is Congressman Richie Torres. So it's funny that the most anti-Jewish candidate and the most pro-Jewish candidate both live in districts with hardly any Jews, and it's interesting. It's likely because of the fact that there are no Jews in their district than otherwise. But I think something we've seen in the past decade that changed also is Jews dropping out of the Democratic Party and not voting in primaries. If you're not a member, you cannot vote. And so elected officials look at that and they see that, the people who are showing up in primaries are pro-Palestinian, communists, socialists, whatever it is, people and general population, but the ones who are most outspoken are no longer Jews. So I think in terms of changing things, if Orthodox Jews or Jews in general got back on the scene, especially in places like New York and California, where they absolutely do have the ability to flip every single seat in the primaries, I think we would be seeing other things. But unfortunately, and I see this on myself, being seen as a Democrat, being registered as a Democrat, voting for a Democrat is stigmatized in our community. And therefore, we have disenfranchised ourselves because our voice doesn't matter as much. Any thoughts?
You're commenting on a strategic error, that the Jewish community too closely identified itself with the Republican Party over the past, let's call it 10 years, it may be longer. And particularly during the Trump era, because Trump's general attitude towards Israel and Jews was very positive, even though there were those who still accused him remarkably of being an anti-Semite. But whatever the case may be, it would appear that during the Trump era, that if you were somebody who was very pro-Israel, that you were going to support Trump, despite all of the discrepancies that may have existed between your views on other topics and the things that Trump was doing in his administration. I think that there, of course, you're absolutely right, that there is a lack of resolve with regard to Jews who vote Democrat with regard to Israel. And those who do have a strong resolve with regard to Israel are no longer registered Democrats, or at least actively Democrats. And that has definitely shifted the center of gravity in the Democrat Party. So despite the fact that Joe Biden, who I remember meeting at AIPAC, I would say probably 8 or 10 years ago, and he's obviously very pro-Israel. I don't think there's any question about that. You may not agree with the things he says about Israel. You may not agree with a two-state solution, but this is not somebody who is negative about Israel, the state of Israel, and having a state of Jews in the Middle East and them being an ally of the United States. He is under pressure because the more progressive elements of his party are clearly anti-Israel, and he has to take, it's politics. Politics is politics. It doesn't matter if it's democracy or autocracy. Every political regime has to concern itself with those who keep it in power. And the people who are keeping Biden in power are people who are very negatively disposed towards Israel. It's a simple fact. So you can't, in a sense, blame him for what he's doing. He wants to stay in power, wants to keep the Democrats in power. He's anti-Republican. Of course he's anti-Republican because he's a Democrat. It makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. The question is, do we now flood the Democratic Party with people who are pro-Israel? And how would one do that? I'm not somebody who has a great sensitivity or understanding of the political process in the United States. I have some understanding of it, obviously, but this is something that people in organizations like AIPAC or in organizations that are pro-Israel need to think about. What does one do to shift the center of gravity in the Democratic Party back in the direction of supporting Israel? There must be ways of doing it. By the way, it's not a project that will take 6 months, a year, or even 5 years. It's a 10 to 20 year project. But it's not impossible. But that deals with things in a sort of long-term way. In the short term, how are we to react to the fact that the moment Israel defends itself against Gaza, lobbing rockets at Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, people flood to the streets and drive through Jewish neighborhoods and target Jews. By the way, Jews have got nothing to do with Israel. And Jews have nothing to do with
Park. Jews beaten in Borough Park, Jews.
Yeah, it could be that these Jews don't support the state of Israel. They've got no idea. I was walking in the streets in Beverly Hills on Shavuos. I wear a black hat, and somebody shouted out of a car, "Free Palestine," to which I responded, I'm very delighted that Palestine is free. I'll take more than one. I thought Shavuos and the Luchas joke, but I'm lucky that the guy didn't climb out of the car and hit me over the head. But the point is that there is this latent anti-Semitism that becomes inflamed the moment Israel starts to behave in any kind of belligerent fashion towards Gaza and Palestinians. It's just a fact. We've lived with it in Europe for years, and now you're seeing it here in the United States. And perhaps it is a timely reminder that we are in Golus. Perhaps we are in the early stages of the Aschalta de Geula. That's why we call it Aschalta de Geula. We've got a state of Israel. We've got Jews living in Israel, the kibbutz Goliath. We've got all the Jewish aspects of life that are enhanced by the existence of the state of Israel. But Mashiach hasn't come. And here in America, whether you're a Zionist or you're an anti-Zionist, you live in Golus. You may have all the rights in the world. You may be able to own a gun because of the Second Amendment. You may even be able to shoot the gun if somebody comes to attack you. But in the end, you're a Jew in Golus. And until Mashiach comes, the perfection that we all hope for and we yearn for hasn't yet happened. And that's something perhaps American Jews are learning for the very first time.
I mean, that's a fascinating perspective. And again, you have more experience. You're from Europe. You have this history of understanding, the waves of anti-Semitism. But the American Jews, myself included, who are absolutely shocked. There's a famous movie. I forgot the name of the movie. I think it's Steven Spielberg with the song "There Are No Cats in America." Where he speaks about the fact that there's no anti-Semitism in America, and there's no hate here. What is the first of all, what should rabbis be doing, and what should Jews be doing as they see this very anti-American phenomenon they have not seen before? How do we move along with this?
I'm not sure. I think it depends where you live and what you want to say. I mean, yesterday I said in my drasha to the shul that I take great pride in the fact that we don't have Jews driving through Muslim neighborhoods and targeting Muslims or Arabs because of their support for the Palestinians who are firing rockets at Israel. I think that's something that we can say, that there is a differentiation between the thugs who support the Palestinian cause and the more decent people who support the Israeli cause. Now, some might say that's because Israel has been successful in repelling the military violence that's coming its way. Perhaps, I don't know. I just know that I have no sense of animosity towards even Palestinians. None whatsoever. I totally understand the fact that they feel frustrated based on their narrative that they don't have what they want. They need to change their narrative. After 70-something years of the state of Israel's existence, I think it's become clear that the state of Israel is here to stay, and notwithstanding the fact that there's people who feel it's illegitimate. Maybe there's people who feel that Zimbabwe is illegitimate. I don't see anybody calling for the dismantling of the state of Zimbabwe because they don't agree with the policies of the late Robert Mugabe. I mean, the whole concept is ridiculous. That being said, I think that we have to take every caution that we can to protect ourselves, which if it means increasing security and training ourselves in the use of firearms and training ourselves in the use of in the art of self-defense. I'm not Rabbi Meir Kahana. I'm not suggesting that we have groups of people roaming the streets ready for violence. On the other hand, I do think that Jews need to be very concerned about the fact that there will be people who will target Jews over the next few months and perhaps on an ongoing basis. And therefore, we need to make sure that we are protected. And we need to do whatever we can to protect ourselves. We have no less rights than Arabs in the United States. And they have no more rights than us. And if AOC wants to spew her anti-Semitic bile for people to listen to, she's entitled to under First Amendment rules. On the other hand, we are also entitled to say that she is spewing that bile and that she doesn't know what she's talking about, and she's wrong and that we are right. we're entitled to say that. Those are the laws of this country.
Right.
Let us hope that the police and the judiciary in this country uphold the law and that they protect our rights as the Jewish community to support the state of Israel and to speak openly about our support for the state of Israel. If that ever changes, we may need to go back to the drawing board and think again about our role in this country and our living here.
Just one more question. First of all, thank you. One more question. I think a very Jewish American thinking has been for decades to stand institutionally, individually, with many, many different groups who were often persecuted, targeted, etc., with the thought that somehow that's going to pay off one day, and that if our difficult days come, those groups will stand with us. Now, obviously, what's right is right. For example, I stand with the Yazidis in Iraq, no matter what. I stand against racism, no matter what. But there has been some kind of Jewish thinking, organizational thinking, of standing with every group, thinking that there will be some reciprocity. Many people have pointed out that reciprocity has not taken place. What are your thoughts on going forward to Jewish American organizations that thought until now in terms of coalitions, allies, and are now not seeing many of those allies showing up? Should anything change, or should everything stay the same?
As an aficionado of Jewish history, I want to tell you that our greatest enemies in this are Jews, not Gentiles, because it is the Jews who are the greatest advocates of the Palestinian cause in the United States of America. And just as at the time of the Hanukkah story, those who aligned themselves with the Greeks were not Greeks, but they were Jews, and the battle that was fought against the Greek army was fought against Jews who were fighting for the Greeks, so too now we need to root out in our community those who are more anti-Israel as a result of their sympathy for Palestinians, than directing our energy against people like AOC. AOC, I don't blame.
And that's a tough statement. I don't agree. What do you mean root out? So, for example,
I'm not sure how to do it, by the way. But the fact is, whenever you see, I'll give you one example that's so prominent that you just can't avoid it. Bernie Sanders is a Jew, and he gets interviewed constantly, and he constantly spews anti-Israel rhetoric. It's a fact. I'm not making this up.
Saying that he's not going to your show, and
so if I get up in my show, I would say, and I do say, that Bernie Sanders may have been born a Jew, but his views are thoroughly un-Jewish, and therefore, simply to quote him or to suggest that what he is saying has anything of has anything worth taking seriously because of his Jewish ancestry is a mistake. We need to say it openly. These people are being used as what we refer to in Yiddish as a kosher chazafisel. That the swine has split hooves, and it appears to be kosher until you realize it doesn't chew the cud. And that's the problem here, is that Bernie Sanders is considered to be Jewish, and therefore his views are considered to be a Jewish view, just like the Neturei Karta. They look like Hasidim, and they dress like religious Jews, and then they say the most vile things about the state of Israel. You have to understand that the moment you do not support the state of Israel and support its existence and survival, and by the way, you don't have to agree with everything the government does. You don't even have to be happy with the fact that it needs to fight a war in which, bombs are dropped and people die. But the bottom line is the state of Israel is not an illegitimate entity. And anybody who implies that it is, and is from within the Jewish community, is 10 times, 100 times more dangerous than an AOC. Bernie Sanders is 100 times more dangerous than AOC. That people need to realize. And if you have within your own community, and I'm talking now, I don't know who's watching this. If you are in the Reform community and you feel that your sympathy lies more with the Palestinian cause than with the Jewish cause of making sure there's a state of Israel where Jews can live unthreatened by anti-Semitism and able to practice their faith without opposition and without prevention, if your sympathy lies with those who would absolutely destroy that at any given opportunity, then you're not part of the Jewish community. It's as simple as that. I don't think it's complicated. I've said it before. I've written it before. It sounds like a radical position. I don't think it's a radical position. If in the United States you have people who don't support the Constitution of the United States, even if they are US citizens, they are enemies of the state. It's as simple as that. And if you are a Jew and you feel that Israel is illegitimate, notwithstanding the fact that it's true that the Palestinian cause has not been well served by the diplomatic community and by political realities, but if you're somebody who feels that Israel is illegitimate, then you are writing yourself out of the equation.
Those are strong words. And like you said, like everything you say, I'm sure you've written extensively about it and have a strong foundation for that. My question is, practically speaking, what are practical stages you would suggest either to Jews being targeted on the streets of New York and Los Angeles, or to Jewish organizations that are rethinking steps forward in America? What would be practical steps?
So simply speaking, if you're an individual, and all individuals feel powerless, that's the reality. As an individual, you always feel powerless. My suggestion to you is you're not powerless. Do something. You have a political representative. It may be your local mayor. It may be the person who represents you in Congress. It may be your senator. Write an email. It's a simple thing to do. Write an email. And you can personalize it. You don't have to use the AIPAC prepared text. You can write your own email. Spend the 10, 15, 20 minutes it's going to take to discover who it is you can write to and write to them. You should know every individual email is considered important in a political office. I have to tell you, that's a fact. I've worked in lobbying and it's a fact. That's the first thing. The second thing is, don't imagine that your voice doesn't count. Your voice counts no less than those people who are demonstrating on the streets. We have a demonstration here in Beverly Hills this afternoon. I'll be attending. I probably will be speaking of local Jews here in Beverly Hills. By the way, Beverly Hills is a very unique city. It's probably one of the only cities in the world which has a majority of Jewish residents outside of Israel. And we will be demonstrating in a pro-Israel way this afternoon. Later on in the afternoon, there is another rally here in Los Angeles outside the Federal Building. Again, we're going to be doing the same thing. Join those rallies. It doesn't matter, by the way, if you are, let's say you are an ultra-Orthodox, you're a Haredi, and you don't feel necessarily an affinity towards the state of Israel, the secular state of Israel. You've never sung the Hatikvah before. Nobody cares. Because when they target you, they're not going to ask you if you know the words to the Hatikvah. And they're not going to ask you whether you support Zionists. They're going to target you because you're Jewish. And because you're Jewish, you are associated with the state of Israel. Like it or hate it, the state of Israel is here. That's where your family, your friends, and where the predominant Jewish community of the world lives and exists. You need to do everything in your power to make sure that that entity, if you value your Jewish identity, by the way, there's plenty of Jews who are ashamed of their Jewish identity. Fine, that's their point of view, and that they can live with that. If that's totally fine. But if you're somebody who davens regularly and celebrates all the chagim, and for whom Shabbos is important, and etc., etc. You don't have to be somebody who necessarily eats kosher, or you could eat glatt kosher and never eat in anyone's house because you don't trust their kashrus. You are identified with the land of Israel, with the state of Israel. And when pro-Palestinians are attacking people for what Israel does against Palestinians, they're going to attack you no less than they'll attack anybody else. And therefore, you need to do everything in your power to make sure that the voice of Israel is heard and that the voice of Israel is strong.
Donner, thank you so much. I hope and pray that we get to speak again about happier and more optimistic topics. But as always, it's I've gotten to see your writings. They're always extremely informed, sometimes a bit above my level, but always very, very informed, researched, and it's an absolute honor to hear from you. And God willing, I look forward to hearing from you again in the future.
I appreciate the fact that you've had me on, and I look forward to being back.
All right, thank you.